In 1861, when the first shots of the Civil War cracked over Fort Sumter, few in Washington or Richmond could have predicted that a winding, brown water river in Virginia would become one of the most fiercely contested corridors of the conflict. The James River, stretching over 340 miles from the Appalachian foothills to the Chesapeake Bay, was more than just a body of water. It was the beating artery of the Confederacy's heart, the lifeline that fed its capital and sustained the armies defending it. Richmond's entire strategic value rested on the James. It carried food, weapons, and supplies from the interior of Virginia to the coastal ports. It connected the city's iron foundries and munitions factories to the broader Confederate war machine. And perhaps most importantly, it provided a natural defensive barrier, a watery shield between Union armies marching south and the industrial core of the rebellion. The Confederacy knew that as long as Richmond stood, the South's political will could endure. But Richmond without the James was a fortress without provisions. In the early years of the war, steamboats laden with tobacco, wheat, and ammunition plied its waters. Confederate quartermasters moved artillery along its banks. Soldiers from the Army of Northern Virginia crossed its ferries to reinforce distant fronts. Even civilian life revolved around its flow. Sawmills, textile mills, and ordnance works thrived on its shores, feeding the Confederate war effort as much as the plantations did. But this same river that nourished the South also tempted the North. To Union strategists, it offered a direct highway into the enemy's capital, a liquid road that bypassed much of Virginia's rugged terrain and the entrenched Confederate lines protecting Richmond by land. As early as 1862, Union generals understood the strategic calculus. George B. McClellan's Peninsula Campaign aimed to use the waterways to strike at Richmond from the east, shipping his massive Army of the Potomac up the York and James rivers. The plan faltered at the 7 days' battles, but the lesson was clear. Control of the river meant control of momentum. Both sides began to fortify its banks. Confederate engineers constructed earthen batteries and placed heavy cannon on bluffs overlooking narrow bends. They scuttled ships and drove pilings into the shallows to create underwater barriers. Mines, then called torpedoes, were planted in the channel to sink unwary Union gunboats. At Drury's Bluff, a steep rise about 8 miles south of Richmond, they built Fort Darling, a bastion bristling with artillery capable of shredding any wooden warship that dared approach. Yet the Union Navy was not deterred. The James was too valuable to abandon, and its control too decisive to ignore. Northern war planners saw the river as a spear aimed directly at the Confederate capital. Gunboats and supply steamers probed its waters, testing Confederate defenses, while engineers mapped its depths and currents for future offensives. The river became a silent front line, a place of constant tension, even when no shots were fired. Confederate pickets patrolled its banks by night, scanning for the faint silhouettes of Union ships. Across the water, Union scouts listened for the clank of chains or the thud of wagon wheels, signs that enemy batteries were being reinforced. By 1863, the James was no longer just a logistical route. It was a symbol of each side's strategic resolve. The Confederacy staked its survival on its ability to hold the river and keep Richmond supplied. The Union invested immense resources to penetrate it, knowing that breaching its defenses would deal a psychological and logistical blow to the rebellion. And beneath this contest lay a deeper reality. The old ways of war were straining against a new industrial age. The James, once a tranquil commercial waterway, was becoming a laboratory for modern conflict, a place where steam, iron, and innovation would soon rewrite centuries of naval doctrine. For Confederate soldiers camped along its banks, the river was a familiar companion and a constant worry. They drew water from it, fished in it, and built campfires near its edges. But they also knew that every ripple could signal danger. Every bend could hide an enemy vessel. They did not yet know that the wooden gunboats they feared would soon be replaced by something far more formidable. The James River had always been vital, but in the crucible of war, it was destined to become something greater, the stage upon which a new era of warfare would be born. When the Civil War began, the navies that prepared to fight it still looked remarkably like those that had sailed a century before. The warships lining the docks in Norfolk, Boston, and New Orleans were descendants of the great frigates of the Napoleonic era. Long, graceful vessels of oak and pine, their sides bristling with rows of smoothbore cannon, and their decks cluttered with rigging and sails. Even the newer steam-driven ships retained the spirit of the age of sail, their iron boilers and paddle wheels grafted onto hulls designed for wind and wood. Admirals and shipbuilders alike believed that naval warfare would continue to be decided by the same principles that had dominated the seas since Trafalgar: maneuverability, the weight of broadsides, and the courage of the men behind the guns. In the spring of 1861, both the Union and the Confederacy scrambled to assemble fleets from whatever they could find. The United States Navy, though larger and more experienced, was spread thin across the globe, protecting trade routes and overseas stations. Many ships were recalled hastily to blockade the southern coastline, a daunting task that would eventually stretch over 3,500 miles. These vessels were mostly wooden screw sloops, side-wheel steamers, and converted merchantmen, adequate for chasing down blockade runners or bombarding coastal fortifications, but still fundamentally products of a pre-industrial navy. The Confederacy, with no established fleet and few shipyards, had to improvise even more. They seized federal vessels in southern ports, refitted aging steamers with cannon, and built makeshift gunboats from river barges and paddle steamers. It was a navy of necessity, held together with desperation and hope. Naval doctrine at the time dictated that decisive engagements would be fought much as they had been in the age of sail. Ships would close to within range, line up in formation, and unleash devastating broadsides against their opponents. Victory depended on discipline, seamanship, and the accuracy of gunnery. Armor was virtually non-existent. Most ships relied on the thickness of their wooden planking to absorb enemy fire. It was an approach steeped in centuries of tradition, and one that commanders on both sides trusted implicitly. Cannons hurled solid shot meant to smash through wooden hulls or set decks ablaze. Heated shot could turn a ship into an inferno in minutes. Chain shot, designed to rip through sails and rigging, was still in use even though steam engines had rendered masts less essential. Yet by the middle of the 19th century, the world had already begun to change. Advances in metallurgy, steam propulsion, and rifled artillery were challenging old assumptions about how wars at sea would be fought. Across the Atlantic, European powers were experimenting with armored ships. In 1859, France launched La Gloire, the world's first seagoing ironclad warship, followed a year later by Britain's HMS Warrior, a vessel clad in wrought iron and armed with heavy rifled guns. These ships made traditional wooden fleets look suddenly fragile. American naval observers took note, but few believed that such radical designs were necessary for the war they were about to fight. The United States, after all, had no imperial rivals building massive iron fleets. The conflict, they assumed, would be decided with the tried-and-true tools of wooden warfare. The first months of the war seemed to confirm that belief. Union gunboats shelled Confederate forts along the coast, and wooden ships enforced the blockade with relative ease. Confederate raiders like the CSS Sumter and CSS Alabama, wooden cruisers armed with conventional guns, struck fear into northern merchant shipping. Yet beneath the surface of these early successes, a quiet anxiety was growing. The rapid industrialization of the North and the ingenuity born of the South's scarcity meant that change was inevitable. Rumors circulated of Southern engineers attempting to armor their river gunboats with railroad iron. Union shipwrights began experimenting with iron plating on new vessels. Reports from Europe of armored ships dominating wooden fleets hinted at a future few American admirals were prepared to face. The stage was set for a dramatic collision between the old world and the new. The men commanding fleets in 1861 still trusted in wood, canvas, and courage. They believed that naval battles would be decided by the weight of broadsides and the skill of gunners, as they always had been. But the tide of technology was rising faster than anyone expected. Within a single year, those towering wooden walls would prove as vulnerable as paper, and the proud traditions of centuries would crumble before a new force born of steam and steel. The transformation that would define modern naval warfare was already on the horizon, and when it came, it would shatter every assumption that sailors and generals held dear. From the moment the Confederacy declared its independence, its leaders knew they were entering a war, stacked heavily against them. The South possessed less than a tenth of the North's industrial capacity. Its foundries were few, its shipyards limited, and its rail network sparse. The Union's navy, by contrast, was one of the largest in the world, and expanding by the month. Within weeks of hostilities breaking out, Washington had announced a massive naval blockade, a cordon meant to choke off Southern trade, starve its economy, and strangle its war effort before it could fully begin. Cotton, the Confederacy's greatest economic weapon, could not reach Europe. Rifles, cannons, and manufactured goods could not come in. The South's ports, from New Orleans to Wilmington, were suddenly lifelines under siege. If the blockade held, the Confederacy would wither. It was a reality that forced Southern leaders to look beyond traditional solutions. Out of that desperation came one of the boldest gambits of the war. Unable to match the Union ship for ship, the Confederacy would instead try to outthink it. If they could not build a large navy, they would build a few ships that no wooden fleet could defeat. In 1861, Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, began quietly soliciting proposals for a new class of warship, steam-powered, armored, and capable of smashing through the blockade. The idea was radical in the context of American naval tradition. Armor was still largely experimental, and the costs of constructing such vessels were enormous. But Mallory and his advisors understood that conventional thinking would lead only to certain defeat. Innovation was their only chance. In the shipyards of Norfolk and Richmond, engineers began sketching designs that blended old and new. The South lacked the resources to build ironclads from scratch, so they turned to what they had, captured hulls, and scuttled ships that could be refitted. The most famous of these was the USS Merrimac, a once proud Union frigate burned and sunk by retreating Federal forces. When they abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard in April 1861, Confederate engineers raised the charred hulk from the mud and began transforming it into something unprecedented. They cut the wooden upper decks down to the waterline and built a massive casemate, a sloped armored shell of oak and pine plated with railroad iron over the remaining hull. Steam engines replaced her sailing rig, and heavy guns were mounted behind iron shutters. When the work was done, the Merrimac had become the CSS Virginia, a floating fortress unlike anything in the Western Hemisphere. The plan was simple but audacious. A single ironclad could do what a dozen wooden ships could not: break the blockade, scatter the Union fleet, and open southern ports to trade once more. Confederate newspapers heralded the project as a potential war winner, a monster ship that would sweep the Yankees from the sea. Yet beneath the optimism lay grim realism. The South had neither the materials nor the manpower to produce ironclads in large numbers. Every ton of iron plating was scavenged from railroads or melted down from farm machinery. Every engine came from repurposed civilian steamers. Even the guns were often cast from recycled bell metal. Each ship built was a gamble, a massive investment of scarce resources that could not be easily replaced if lost. Still, the stakes demanded risk. By late 1861, Union blockades were tightening around vital ports, and British and French merchants were growing hesitant to defy them. Confederate leaders believed that even the threat of an ironclad sortie could disrupt Union operations and buy time for diplomacy or foreign intervention. The Virginia was only the beginning. Plans were laid for additional armored gunboats and rams to guard rivers and harbors. Smaller shipyards in places like Savannah and New Orleans began experimenting with their own designs, using whatever materials they could find. The gamble would soon be tested. In early 1862, Union intelligence learned of the Virginia's construction and feared the havoc she could wreak. The U.S. Navy scrambled to respond, rushing its own ironclad, the experimental USS Monitor, into service in a desperate race against time. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only decide the fate of the blockade, but also signal a turning point in naval history. What began as an act of necessity, born of Southern scarcity and desperation, was about to reshape the balance of power on the water. The Confederacy's iron gamble was in motion, and the outcome would reverberate far beyond the James River. When Union forces abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard at Norfolk in April 1861, they tried to ensure that nothing useful would fall into Confederate hands. Among the ships scuttled and burned was the USS Merrimac, a proud steam frigate launched just 5 years earlier and one of the most advanced vessels in the U.S. Navy. She sank in shallow water, her upperworks charred and gutted, her engines damaged but intact beneath the surface. Both saw her as a total loss, a smouldering relic destined to rot in the mud. But to Confederate engineers, desperate for a way to challenge the Union's growing naval superiority, the wreck presented an opportunity that could not be ignored. In June 1861, Confederate Secretary of the Navy, Stephen Mallory, approved a bold proposal to resurrect the Merrimac in a radically new form. Under the direction of John L. Porter, the chief naval constructor, and Lieutenant John M. Brooke, an innovative ordnance officer, the ship would be reborn, not as a conventional warship, but as a revolutionary ironclad. Her role was clear from the start: smash through the Union blockade, terrorize wooden ships that dared to oppose her, and safeguard the James River approaches to Richmond. The work began with the laborious task of raising the sunken hull. Divers and dockworkers, often laboring knee-deep in foul water and mud, patched leaks, pumped out the flooded interior, and stripped away the remains of her burned decks. Once refloated, the hull was cut down almost to the waterline. Upon this truncated frame, Confederate engineers built a massive casemate, a sloped armored citadel constructed of thick layers of oak and pine and sheathed in 2 inches of railroad iron hammered into plates. The angled design was intentional, meant to deflect cannonballs rather than absorb their full force. It was an engineering gamble, untested in American waters, but it promised to make the new ship all but invulnerable to the traditional naval artillery of the day. The Virginia, as she would now be called, was fitted with a formidable armament. 10 heavy guns were mounted inside the casemate, 6 powerful 9-inch Dahlgren smoothbores and 4 rifled cannon, including a pair of 7-inch Brooke rifles capable of piercing the thickest hulls. 2 iron rams projected from her bow, a deadly nod to ancient naval tactics revived for the Iron Age. Below deck, her twin-screw engines, salvaged from the Merrimac, were overhauled and reinstalled, giving the ironclad a top speed of about 5 knots. She was slow and unwieldy, but she did not need speed. Her strength lay in her resilience and destructive power. Everything about the Virginia represented the Confederacy's improvisational spirit. Iron plating was scarce, so railroad tracks were torn up and reforged into armor. Steam engines were cannibalized from other vessels. Skilled labor was in short supply, forcing shipwrights and blacksmiths to work long hours under punishing conditions. Yet despite every obstacle, the project pushed forward. On February 17, 1862, the CSS Virginia was commissioned into the Confederate Navy, a warship unlike any seen in the Americas. Her appearance was striking. Low in the water, her iron-plated casemate rising like a black pyramid above the surface, smoke curling from a single funnel amidships. Where once the Merrimac had been a graceful wooden frigate, the Virginia was a floating fortress, more machine than ship. Her mission was as ambitious as her design. Richmond was the lifeblood of the Confederacy, and the James River was its shield. Yet Union ships dominated the Chesapeake Bay and threatened to push upriver at any moment. The blockade, tightened with each passing month, threatened to starve the South into submission. The Virginia was meant to change all that. She would challenge the Union's wooden fleet head-on, destroy its ships with gunfire and iron ram, and open the way for commerce and resupply. Confederate leaders hoped that even the mere rumor of her presence would scatter Union blockading squadrons and buy the South precious time. But the stakes were higher than any single naval engagement. If the Virginia succeeded, she would not only protect the James, but prove that armored warships were the future of naval warfare. If she failed, she would represent a ruinous waste of scarce resources, iron, steam power, and manpower the Confederacy could ill afford to lose. Everything rested on her maiden voyage, and the world watched with curiosity and dread. In shipyards across Europe and America, naval architects followed reports of the strange new vessel taking shape in Norfolk. They understood what many officers in Washington still did not. The age of wooden navies was nearing its end. And when the CSS Virginia finally slipped her moorings and steamed into Hampton Roads, she carried with her not just the hopes of a besieged nation, but the future of naval warfare itself. On the morning of March 8, 1862, Union sailors stationed aboard the wooden frigates of the North Atlantic blockading squadron peered nervously toward the mouth of the Elizabeth River. A strange silhouette was moving steadily toward them. Low in the water, flat and angular, with smoke belching from a single funnel, it did not look like a ship at all, more like a floating roofline of iron. The vessel was the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia, steaming into Hampton Roads for her first trial by fire. Her mission was simple and devastating: smash the Union blockade, destroy the wooden warships anchored there, and clear the way for Confederate commerce on the Chesapeake and James rivers. The Union squadron had no inkling of what awaited them. Their ships, the frigates Cumberland and Congress, the sloop St. Lawrence, and the steam frigate Minnesota, were imposing wooden warships, bristling with dozens of guns. Against any conventional opponent, they would have been formidable. Against an ironclad, they were lambs before the slaughter. As the Virginia closed the distance, Union gunners unleashed a furious barrage. Cannonballs screamed through the air and crashed against her sloped iron sides, only to ricochet harmlessly into the water. One sailor later recalled the sound as like peas thrown against a wall. The Virginia's guns roared in reply. Massive shells smashed into the Cumberland's hull, splintering timbers and sending men sprawling. Then, in a moment that stunned both fleets, the Confederate ironclad drove her iron ram into the frigate's starboard side. Water surged through the gaping wound, and within minutes the Cumberland was sinking, her colors still flying defiantly above the waves. Next, the Virginia turned her attention to the Congress. A storm of shells set the frigate ablaze, forcing her crew to surrender before exploding magazines consumed her in a towering fireball. The remaining Union vessels, terrified and outmatched, ran aground or fled into shallower waters where the deep-drafted Virginia could not follow. The news of the massacre spread with astonishing speed. Telegraph lines carried word to Washington and Richmond alike. A single Confederate ironclad had annihilated 2 Union warships and scattered the rest in a single afternoon. Panic gripped the Union command. If the Virginia steamed into the Chesapeake, she could bombard coastal cities, sink transports, and sever supply lines. But as night fell and the Confederate vessel anchored for the evening, salvation was steaming toward Hampton Roads from the north. The Union's own ironclad, the experimental USS Monitor, had arrived just in time. The morning of March 9th dawned cold and hazy, and the world's first duel between ironclads was about to begin. The two strange vessels could not have been more different. The Virginia, rebuilt from the hull of the Merrimac, was massive and imposing, bristling with heavy guns and armored on all sides. The Monitor, by contrast, was small, squat and revolutionary, a low, flat deck barely above the waterline, dominated by a single rotating turret mounting 2 11-inch Dahlgren cannons. She looked like a cheese box on a raft, one observer quipped, but appearances would soon prove deceptive. For 4 hours, the Ironclads circled and battered one another at point-blank range. Cannonballs slammed into iron plating, sending showers of sparks and plumes of steam skyward. Each side sought an advantage. The Virginia attempting to ram or disable the Monitor trying to exploit her superior maneuverability and faster reload time. Yet neither ship could deal a decisive blow. Shot after shot bounced harmlessly away. The battle was unlike anything naval warfare had ever seen. No splintered decks, no towering masts crashing into the sea, no wooden hulls erupting into flames. It was a contest of endurance, engineering, and will. At last, as afternoon approached, the fight ended by mutual withdrawal. The Virginia, damaged and short on ammunition, limped back to Norfolk. The Monitor, battered but intact, remained to guard the blockade. On paper, the duel was a stalemate. Neither side had sunk the other, and the Union blockade remained intact. But the consequences were far larger than the tactical outcome. The age of wooden warships had ended in a single weekend. Naval planners in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg studied the reports with awe and alarm. Around the world, shipyards halted the construction of wooden ships and began laying down ironclads. The very concept of naval power had been rewritten. For the men along the James River, the lesson was clear. No fort, no battery, and no wooden gunboat could now be considered safe. The Virginia and Monitor had ushered in a new era, one in which iron, steam, and industrial ingenuity would decide the fate of nations. The James, once a quiet artery of commerce and supply, was now a proving ground for the future of war. And as both sides prepared for the long struggle ahead, they knew the next battles on its waters would never again be fought in wood. The battle at Hampton Roads was more than a clash between two experimental ships. It was a thunderclap that echoed through every naval office in Washington. The United States had entered the Civil War with a fleet steeped in the traditions of wooden warfare, confident that its blockading squadrons and powerful frigates could bottle up the Confederacy's ports with ease. That illusion was shattered in a single weekend. The destruction wrought by the CSS Virginia and the stunning performance of the USS Monitor had proven that naval supremacy would no longer be decided by oak and canvas. The future belonged to iron, and the Union Navy understood that it had no choice but to embrace that future with unprecedented urgency. Even before the smoke cleared from Hampton Roads, Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles convened emergency meetings with shipbuilders, engineers, and naval officers. The lesson was clear. The Union needed ironclads, many of them, and it needed them fast. The North's vast industrial capacity, long considered a strategic advantage on land, was now turned toward the water. Foundries in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston were contracted to produce iron plating. Shipyards along the East Coast and Great Lakes were ordered to switch from traditional frigates and sloops to ironclads, armored gunboats, and turreted river steamers. What had begun as a handful of experimental vessels became within months a full-scale crash program that would reshape the U.S. Navy. The centerpiece of this new fleet was the Monitor class itself. John Ericsson's radical design, dismissed by some as a novelty before Hampton Roads, was suddenly the blueprint for the future. The Navy ordered dozens of improved monitors, each with heavier armor, more powerful guns, and refined turret mechanisms. They were smaller and cheaper than traditional ships of the line, and they could be built quickly. By 1863, new monitors were sliding down the ways at a remarkable pace, destined for blockade squadrons, coastal assaults, and river operations from Virginia to the Mississippi. Their low profiles made them difficult targets. Their revolving turrets allowed them to engage enemies in any direction, and their thick armor rendered them nearly immune to the weapons that once ruled the seas. The Union did not limit itself to coastal ironclads. Recognizing the strategic importance of the nation's rivers, vital arteries for supply, troop movement, and invasion, The Navy and the War Department jointly commissioned a fleet of armored river gunboats. Known as Pook turtles for their curved casemates, these vessels prowled the Mississippi and its tributaries, blasting through Confederate river defenses and paving the way for Union armies pushing south. Other projects saw civilian steamers converted into improvised ironclads, their decks reinforced with railroad iron and fitted with heavy guns. Even hastily built gunboats, crewed by naval standards, could devastate Confederate forts and shipping with their superior firepower and resilience. The North's industrial muscle made this transformation possible. Ironworks in Pennsylvania and New Jersey worked around the clock, hammering out thousands of tons of armor plate. Steam engines rolled off assembly lines, once devoted to locomotives and factory machinery. The shipbuilding workforce swelled as carpenters, machinists, and laborers were drawn into the war effort. For the first time in history, a major navy was being constructed on an industrial scale, with ships designed, built, and launched in a matter of months rather than years. It was a feat the Confederacy, with its limited resources and scattered infrastructure, could never hope to match. The strategic impact was immediate. Ironclads began to appear on every major waterway and coastline, their presence altering the balance of power. Confederate commanders, who had once hoped to challenge the Union blockade, now found themselves facing armored fleets capable of withstanding coastal batteries and ramming through obstructions. Southern ironclad projects, already hampered by shortages of iron, skilled labor, and engines, could not keep pace. By late 1863, the Union Navy not only controlled the seas, but dominated the rivers, using its armored squadrons to support land campaigns, transport troops, and cut deep into the Confederate heartland. Yet perhaps the most profound consequence of this rapid transformation was psychological. The United States Navy, once a secondary force focused on protecting commerce and showing the flag abroad, was now an engine of technological innovation and industrial might. Its growing fleet of ironclads embodied the Union war effort itself, relentless, adaptive, and overwhelming. Every new launch sent a message to Richmond and to Europe. The North was not merely reacting to Confederate innovation, it was surpassing it. The Confederacy's daring gamble with the Virginia had forced a revolution, but it was the Union that would master it. The rivers and coasts of the South would never again be safe, and the James River, once the Confederacy's lifeline, was becoming a corridor of iron under Northern control. After the shock of Hampton Roads, Confederate leaders recognized that if Richmond was to survive, the James River had to be fortified as if it were a land front. The Union Navy's growing fleet of ironclads had made clear that the river was no longer just a line on a map. It was a potential highway straight into the Confederate capital. If Northern warships could force their way upriver, they could bypass much of General Lee's defensive network, shell the city, and cripple the Confederacy's industrial and political heart. With that danger in mind, engineers and soldiers set to work, transforming the James into a gauntlet of defenses that would, they believed, stop even the most powerful ironclad from reaching Richmond. The most important of these defenses rose at a place called Drury's Bluff. About 8 miles south of the capital, the river makes a sharp bend and narrows beneath a steep embankment more than 90 feet high. It was a natural choke point, and the Confederacy turned it into a fortress. Work began in the spring of 1862, with enslaved laborers, soldiers, and local civilians hauling earth, timber, and stone to build the imposing stronghold that would become known as Fort Darling. Its guns were mounted far above the water, giving them a plunging field of fire against any approaching vessel. Heavy artillery pieces, including 8-inch and 10-inch Columbiads and rifled Parrott guns, were emplaced behind thick parapets. From that height, they could lob shells directly onto the decks of enemy ships, where armor was thinnest and most vulnerable. Below the fort, the Confederates created additional layers of defense. They scuttled old ships in the channel, driving their hulls into the riverbed to form underwater barriers. Large wooden piles were hammered into the river bottom to snag and slow advancing vessels. Mines, or torpedoes as they were called at the time, were anchored in the shallows, ready to explode under the hull of an unsuspecting gunboat. Chains and booms stretched across narrow points to obstruct passage, rifle pits and shore. Batteries lined the banks, ready to pour musket fire into landing parties that might attempt to seize the heights by force. The James River was being transformed into a killing ground, a place where the Confederacy hoped the Union Navy's technological edge would count for little. The effectiveness of these defenses was put to the test almost immediately. In May 1862, a Union flotilla, including the USS Galena, an early ironclad gunboat, and the famed USS Monitor, attempted to steam past Drury's Bluff and bombard Richmond. As the ships approached, Fort Darling erupted with fire. Shells screamed down from above, tearing into decks and superstructures. The Galena, though armored, was riddled with holes. Dozens of sailors were killed or wounded. The Monitor, with her shallow draft and low freeboard, found herself unable to elevate her guns high enough to return effective fire against the towering bluff. After hours of punishing bombardment, the Union squadron was forced to retreat, battered and bloodied. For the Confederacy, the victory was a powerful reassurance that their river defenses could indeed hold. The success at Drury's Bluff inspired even greater confidence. Over the following months and years, additional fortifications and batteries were added along the river's length. Obstructions were repaired and reinforced. Patrol boats and picket stations watched for Union movements, while engineers regularly inspected and updated the torpedo fields. The Confederate Navy's James River Squadron, including ironclads like Virginia II and Richmond, was stationed upstream, ready to sally forth in support of the forts if needed. Together, these elements formed a layered defense system that the Confederacy believed no enemy fleet could breach. That belief, however, carried with it a measure of overconfidence. The river's defenses were formidable, but they were also static. Every chain and sunken ship, every torpedo and gun emplacement was fixed in place, designed to repel a frontal assault, much like the failed Union attempt of 1862. They did not account for the relentless innovation of the Northern war machine, the ever-growing fleet of heavier, more powerful ironclads, or the combined arms strategies that would later integrate naval bombardment with infantry assaults and engineering operations. In the short term, Fort Darling was a triumph, a symbol of Confederate resilience and ingenuity. But it also embodied a belief that the war could still be won by building walls and waiting for the enemy to break against them. For now, though, Richmond slept a little easier. Drury's Bluff had repelled the Union once and stood ready to do so again. Confederate soldiers atop its parapets gazed down at the muddy waters of the James and felt confident that no enemy ship could pass. They believed the capital was safe, the river secure, and the ironclads contained. It was a comforting illusion, one that would hold for a time until the full weight of Northern industry and strategy pressed once more against the heart of the Confederacy. By the spring of 1864, the Civil War had entered a new and merciless phase. President Abraham Lincoln had placed his faith in Ulysses S. Grant, the man who had broken the Confederacy's grip on the Mississippi and delivered Vicksburg into Union hands. As General-in-Chief, Grant brought a new kind of war to Virginia, a war of relentless pressure and unyielding momentum. He knew that the conflict could no longer be won by isolated victories or limited campaigns. The Confederacy's armies had to be destroyed in the field, and its capital, Richmond, had to fall. Every rail line, every road, and every river leading to the city became a potential axis of attack. Among these, none was more strategically vital than the James. The river had always been a lifeline, but by 1864 it was also a dagger pointed directly at the Confederate heart. If Union forces could seize control of the James, they could bypass Robert E. Lee's entrenched defenses, isolate Richmond, and strike at its industrial base. It was a tantalizing prospect and a daunting challenge. The Confederate defenses along the river, strengthened after the 1862 attempt to bypass Drury's Bluff, were now even more formidable. Fort Darling loomed over the water like a watchful sentinel, its guns heavier and its magazines deeper. Torpedoes were laid thick in the channel, new obstructions blocked navigation, and picket boats prowled the shallows. The Confederate James River Squadron, though outmatched by the Union's expanding navy, remained a constant threat. Any assault on the river would require coordination on a scale the Union had not yet attempted. Grant's plan was ambitious and comprehensive. His overland campaign aimed to pin down Lee's army in brutal, grinding battles while simultaneously applying pressure from multiple directions. As infantry clashed at the Wilderness and Spotsylvania, the Union Navy prepared for its own offensive. New ironclads and monitors were deployed to the James, their heavy guns and reinforced armor designed to withstand the punishing fire from Confederate batteries. Transports and supply vessels followed, carrying the logistical lifeblood of Grant's advancing armies. The river, once a quiet defensive line, was becoming a front in its own right. In early June, Union troops under Major General Benjamin Butler had already pushed up the James, establishing a foothold at Bermuda Hundred, a strategic peninsula formed by the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers. From there, they probed Confederate positions and scouted the river's defenses. Butler's efforts were inconclusive, hampered by strong Confederate counterattacks and cautious naval commanders wary of torpedoes and hidden artillery. Yet the position itself was significant, a forward base from which future operations could launch deeper into Confederate territory. The naval build-up intensified through the summer. New monitors, squat, turreted ironclads with thicker armor and heavier guns than their predecessors, arrived to join the growing James River flotilla. Wooden gunboats were refitted with additional plating, while specially designed torpedo-sweeping vessels worked to clear safe channels through Confederate minefields. The Union was learning from its earlier failures. Every element of the coming assault, from artillery support to engineering detachments, was meticulously planned. Grant's army and the Navy would move together, each supporting the other in a coordinated push toward Richmond. The Confederates watched these preparations with growing alarm. Reports from scouts and signal stations along the river warned of massive concentrations of Union shipping. Naval activity at City Point, a once quiet riverside landing now transformed into one of the largest supply depots in the world, suggested that a major offensive was imminent. The defenders at Drury's Bluff tightened their patrols, tested their guns, and reinforced their parapets. They knew that another attempt to breach the James was coming, and that this time the Union had no intention of turning back. The stakes were higher than ever. By mid-1864, the Confederacy was bleeding manpower and material. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia was locked in a deadly war of attrition against Grant's relentless offensives. Richmond's factories strained to supply the front, while its population faced shortages of food and fuel. If the James fell into Union hands, the capital's isolation would be complete, and the war's end would draw near. For Grant, the river represented not just a strategic pathway, but the key to victory itself. As the summer dragged on, the tension along the James thickened like the humid Virginia air. Union ships edged closer to the Confederate lines, their black iron hulls reflecting the sun as they tested the limits of the defenses. Confederate gunners watched through field glasses, ready to unleash their fire at the first sign of an advance. It was a waiting game now, one that both sides knew would soon erupt into violence. The siege was tightening around Richmond from every direction, and the James River, once merely a lifeline, was about to become the decisive battlefield on which the fate of a nation would turn. By the autumn of 1864, the James River had become a place of constant tension. Union gunboats prowled its lower reaches, probing for weaknesses in the Confederate defenses, while pickets on the high banks watched day and night for signs of an impending assault. Both sides knew the river's fate would shape the destiny of Richmond itself. But in late October, a new arrival changed the character of that waiting game. When the silhouette of the USS Onondaga appeared on the horizon, gliding steadily up the James, Confederate observers who had once scoffed at Union engineering fell silent. This was no ordinary warship. This was the embodiment of a new naval philosophy, a vessel designed not simply to challenge Confederate defenses, but to obliterate them. The Onondaga was unlike anything the South had faced before. Laid down at Greenpoint, New York in 1862 and commissioned the following year, she was part of a new generation of Monitor-class ironclads, larger, stronger, and more heavily armed than their predecessors. At 226 feet long and over 2,500 tons, she dwarfed the original Monitor. Her double-turret configuration housed 4 massive 15-inch Dahlgren smoothbore guns, each capable of hurling a 350-pound projectile with devastating force. These weapons could smash through masonry, obliterate fortifications, and punch holes in even the thickest armor plates. Her 5-inch iron belt plating and low profile made her nearly impervious to enemy fire, while her steam engines gave her steady, if not swift, mobility in the narrow confines of the river. She was a floating fortress, slow but unstoppable, and her very presence altered the calculus of the James. For months, Confederate artillerymen had trained their guns on the river, confident that their elevated batteries and carefully constructed obstructions would repel any Union vessel that dared approach. They had mocked the early monitors as cheese boxes and tin cans, fragile and limited in their firepower. But the Onondaga was different. Her twin turrets rotated smoothly, allowing her to bring her heavy guns to bear in any direction without needing to turn her hull. Her armor could shrug off even the heaviest shot from Drury's Bluff, and unlike the earlier Monitor, which had struggled to elevate its guns to strike at high riverbanks, Onondaga's fire could reach targets once considered safe. Confederate soldiers stationed at Fort Darling watched the new ironclad steam past their positions with a mixture of fascination and dread. They knew instinctively that the balance of power on the James was shifting, and not in their favor. The arrival of Onondaga also signaled a shift in Union strategy. No longer content merely to blockade or harass, the Navy was preparing for a decisive push upriver. The ironclad was stationed near Deep Bottom as part of the James River Flotilla, tasked with protecting troop transports, supporting ground offensives, and challenging Confederate naval forces should they attempt to break out. Her heavy guns regularly dueled with shore batteries, silencing Confederate positions that had once menaced smaller vessels. At night, she anchored mid-channel, an immovable guardian against Confederate ironclads that might attempt a surprise attack under cover of darkness. Her mere presence complicated Confederate planning. The James River Squadron, including the Virginia II, Richmond, and Fredericksburg, had been built with the hope of contesting Union control of the river. But even combined, their firepower paled before the Onondaga. Her guns could penetrate their armor at ranges they could not match, and her turrets allowed her to engage multiple targets without repositioning. Confederate captains knew that an open confrontation could mean annihilation, yet doing nothing meant surrendering the initiative and allowing Union forces to tighten their grip on Richmond. It was a dilemma with no easy solution. For Union troops advancing on land, the psychological impact of Onondaga's presence was as significant as her tactical value. Soldiers moving supplies along the river or building pontoon bridges did so under the reassuring shadow of her guns. Every Confederate attempt to shell supply lines or bombard river traffic was met with thunderous counterfire from the ironclad. She became a symbol of Union inevitability, proof that Northern industry and engineering could build war machines the South could neither match nor stop. To the Confederates watching from the bluffs, The message was just as clear. The days when a few guns and a well-placed barrier could halt the Union fleet were ending. The Onondaga was a harbinger of a new reality, a river war fought not by wooden ships or improvised gunboats, but by armored giants whose power dwarfed anything the Confederacy could muster. The sight of her iron hull gliding silently through the mist, turrets slowly turning toward the shore, reminded them that the siege of Richmond was entering its final, most perilous stage. The river they had once believed secure was now a Union weapon, and the Onondaga was the blade aimed straight at their capital. The winter of 1865 was bitter along the James. Ice crusted the edges of the river, and the skeletal trees that lined its banks stood silent under a cold, grey sky. But beneath that stillness, a storm was gathering. Richmond was starving, and the Confederate cause was crumbling under the weight of exhaustion. Grant's forces were closing from every direction, tightening the noose around the capital. The Union Navy, with its ironclads anchored firmly along the river, ensured that no supplies or reinforcements could slip through. The James, once the South's lifeline, had become a cage. And so, in a final gamble to break the stalemate, the Confederacy turned once more to its own ironclad fleet. On the night of January 23, 1865, 3 armored vessels, Virginia II, Richmond, and Fredericksburg, slipped their moorings under the cover of darkness and steamed slowly downriver toward destiny. The plan was daring and desperate. The James River Squadron, commanded by Rear Admiral John K. Mitchell, was to force its way past the Union blockade, destroy as many enemy vessels as possible, and wreak havoc on the supply depots that kept Grant's siege machine moving. With luck, they might even reach City Point, the vast logistical hub where Union supplies flowed like lifeblood into the front. Success could not save the Confederacy, but it might prolong the fight, buy Lee time, and give Richmond a chance to endure a little longer. It was a plan fraught with risk. The Confederate ironclads, though formidable, were outgunned and outnumbered, and the river ahead was bristling with Union firepower. The 3 ships moved cautiously through the icy current, their engines muffled and lanterns darkened. Lookouts scanned the night for the glimmer of Union pickets or the silhouette of enemy ironclads. They were not alone. Accompanying the ironclads were several wooden gunboats and a handful of small torpedo boats, desperate measures to tip the odds, even slightly in their favor. But almost from the start, things went wrong. The tide was lower than expected, and several of the Confederate vessels struggled to navigate the shallow stretches. Near Trent's Reach, they encountered a field of obstructions, sunken hulks and chains placed there by Union engineers. The Richmond and Fredericksburg managed to pass, but the Virginia II, the flagship and most powerful of the 3, ran aground. Hours passed as crews worked frantically to free her, and the element of surprise, their greatest advantage, slipped away when dawn began to pale the horizon. Union lookouts spotted the Confederate squadron inching its way downriver. Alarms rang out aboard anchored gunboats, and signal flags snapped above Fort Brady, a heavily armed Union position that commanded a bend in the river. Within minutes, the stillness of the January morning shattered. The Union batteries opened fire, sending plumes of water and shards of iron skyward as shells crashed around the advancing ironclads. The Confederate ships answered with their own guns, their heavy broadsides echoing off the frozen banks. Smoke blanketed the water, and the James erupted into chaos. The Virginia II, finally freed from the mud, joined the fight, her iron sides deflecting round after round as she pushed forward. The Richmond and Fredericksburg closed ranks beside her, trading punishing volleys with Union monitors and shore batteries. For a moment it seemed as if they might break through. But the Union fleet was ready. The USS Onondaga, with her twin turrets and massive Dahlgren guns, steamed forward into the fray, her shells smashing into the Confederate line with devastating effect. Smaller gunboats darted in and out, concentrating fire on the slower, lumbering ironclads. Every yard gained came at a terrible cost. Beneath the guns of Fort Brady, the river boiled with fire and iron. Confederate shells exploded against the fort's parapets, while Union shot ricocheted off the sloped armor of the advancing ships. Yet the weight of Union fire was too much to bear. The Fredericksburg began to take on water after repeated hits. The Richmond's engines faltered, slowing her advance. And as daylight grew stronger, the Confederate commanders realized the truth. The breakout had failed. Their fleet was trapped, battered, and outmatched. With no hope of reaching City Point, Mitchell ordered a withdrawal. As the battered ironclads turned upriver, their decks scarred and their crews exhausted. They carried with them the bitter knowledge that the James would never again be theirs to control. The breakout attempt had ended not in triumph, but in grim inevitability. The Union's armored fleet remained unshaken, its blockade unbroken. The guns of Fort Brady still loomed over the river, and the siege of Richmond continued, tightening with every passing day. That night, the James had roared with the fury of one last Confederate gamble, and in that roar, the final echoes of Southern naval power faded into silence. The Confederate gunners along the James had been taught to believe in the power of their guns. For 4 long years, they had manned the earthworks and batteries that guarded the river's bends and narrow channels, and they had seen what their artillery could do. Heavy Columbiads and Parrott rifles had shattered wooden gunboats into splinters, hurled fire into decks, and sent enemy crews leaping overboard into the dark waters below. These weapons were the pride of the river defenses, their muzzles blackened by years of firing, their crews drilled to a precise rhythm of load, aim, and fire. Yet by 1865, the battlefield had changed in ways that left those same gunners staring in disbelief as their once deadly shells bounced harmlessly off the sides of Union warships like pebbles against a wall. The moment the Confederate breakout faltered beneath Fort Brady, the artillery duel intensified. Shore batteries roared to life, their guns firing in coordinated salvos meant to smash the advancing Union fleet before it could press any closer to Richmond. Shell after shell screamed through the cold January air, striking the hulls of ironclads like the Onondaga, the Hunchback, and the Mendota. The expected sounds of battle, the crash of timber, the crack of masts, the eruption of flames, never came. Instead, the Confederate gunners heard the strange hollow clang of metal striking metal, followed by the hiss of deflected shot disappearing into the river. Some shells shattered on impact, spraying useless fragments across the iron plating. Others ricocheted wildly into the air, arching harmlessly back into the water. At first, the crews believed their aim was off. They adjusted elevation, recalibrated range, and tried again. But the results were the same. Even their heaviest projectiles, once capable of punching through several feet of oak planking, now failed to breach the 5-inch armor plating that shielded the Union vessels. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Decades of artillery doctrine, built around the vulnerabilities of wooden ships, had been rendered obsolete in a matter of months. The old strategies no longer worked. The river, once a killing ground where well-placed fire could turn back any flotilla, had become a proving ground for industrial warfare, a contest of metallurgy and engineering rather than shot and powder. The Union crews, for their part, were emboldened by the sight. Inside the iron bellies of their ships, sailors felt the jarring impacts reverberate through the hulls, but knew the armor would hold. They continued their slow, deliberate advance, their turrets rotating methodically to bring their own massive guns to bear. When they fired, the results were devastating. Union shells, heavier and more powerful than anything the Confederates could muster, slammed into the riverbanks, tearing through parapets and collapsing gun emplacements. Batteries that had once commanded respect were silenced one by one, their defenders forced to abandon their positions or risk annihilation. From the Confederate perspective, the scene was surreal. Officers peering through field glasses watched as their cannonballs glanced off the ironclads and splashed into the water. Messages from Fort Darling reported similar frustrations. The river defenses, once considered impregnable, were proving almost useless against the Union's armored fleet. "It is as if the river itself rejects our fire," one Confederate artilleryman wrote in a letter days later. "The shells we once trusted fall back into the water as though mocking us." The psychological impact was profound. The very weapons that had defended Richmond for years now felt like relics from another age. The futility of their fire exposed a deeper truth that few in the Confederate ranks wanted to admit. The South's industrial limitations were crippling its ability to adapt. While the Union poured resources into manufacturing heavier guns and developing new armor-piercing shells, the Confederacy struggled to maintain its aging artillery. Iron for larger calibers was scarce, gunpowder production was inconsistent, and experiments with specialized munitions had yielded little success. The defenders were fighting a modern war with outdated tools, and every ricochet drove that reality home. As the battle raged on beneath the cold winter sky, the James River became a stark symbol of the changing nature of war. Once the Confederates had relied on courage, skill, and the destructive force of their guns to hold the line. Now they were facing opponents who had rendered those advantages meaningless with steel and steam. Cannonballs that once decided the fate of battles now bounced harmlessly into the water, and the soldiers who had wielded them felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. The roar of their batteries still echoed across the river, but it carried with it a new, bitter understanding that no amount of bravery or determination could stop the relentless march of industrial power. The Ironclads were rewriting the rules of warfare, and the Confederate gunners, for all their valor, could do little but watch as the future advanced toward them, unstoppable and unyielding. For nearly 3 years, Drury's Bluff had stood as a symbol of Confederate defiance. Perched high above the James River, its steep earthen walls and heavy artillery had turned back Union fleets and shielded Richmond from the gunboats that prowled below. Fort Darling was more than a military installation. It was a psychological fortress, a reminder that the South still possessed strongholds the Union could not breach. But by the spring of 1865, that sense of invulnerability had become a fragile illusion. The industrial might of the North was bearing down from every direction, and the once unthinkable prospect of Drury's Bluff falling was no longer a question of if, but when. The final siege began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as Union naval activity along the James increased in intensity. Ironclads like the Onondaga, Mahopac, and Canonicus anchored closer to Confederate lines than ever before, their massive Dahlgren guns probing the defenses with methodical bombardments. At first, the shells did little more than scar the fort's earthworks and topple sections of its parapets. But over time, the relentless pounding took its toll. Every day, tons of iron and steel rained down from the river below, shaking the ground and cracking the very foundations of the bluff. Gun crews inside the fort grew accustomed to the constant thunder, but the wear was visible. Artillery pieces were disabled one by one, ammunition magazines were damaged, and supply routes leading to the fort became increasingly difficult to maintain under the barrage. The naval assault was only part of a larger strategy. As Grant's armies pressed deeper into the Confederate heartland, infantry columns crept ever closer to the fort's rear. By early April, Union troops had established entrenched positions within striking distance of the bluff's landward side. Artillery batteries were wheeled into place on the high ground behind it, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned down the Confederate defenders. Fort Darling, designed primarily to repel attacks from the river, now found itself threatened from multiple directions. Its once formidable defenses, the plunging cannons, the torpedo fields, the underwater obstructions, were nearly useless against the infantry tightening the noose from above. Inside the fort, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Ammunition was scarce, food supplies dwindled, and the garrison's morale began to fracture. Many of the men stationed there were veterans of the 1862 battle that had driven off the Monitor and Galena. They had once taken pride in the belief that Drury's Bluff was untouchable. But as they watched their rounds bounce harmlessly off the ironclad hulls below and heard the distant rumble of Union columns advancing from the south, that pride gave way to grim resignation. They knew they were fighting not just an enemy, but the crushing weight of industrial superiority, an enemy measured not in numbers, but in factories, foundries, and endless supplies of iron and powder. The final blow came with a coordinated assault in the first days of April. Union ironclads unleashed their heaviest bombardment yet, hurling 15-inch shells into the fort's weakened defenses. The concussion was so intense that sections of the parapet collapsed entirely, burying gun crews beneath tons of earth. At the same time, infantry units surged forward through the surrounding woods, cutting off escape routes and seizing the supply roads leading into the bluff. Confederate artillerymen, their guns silenced or destroyed, turned to muskets and pistols as they prepared for the inevitable breach. The defenders fought stubbornly, clinging to their posts as shells exploded around them and blue-coated soldiers closed in from all sides. But resistance could not last. By April 3rd, Union troops had forced their way into the outer works, and with their guns neutralized and their position untenable, the Confederate garrison had no choice but to abandon the fort. Many slipped away under cover of night, retreating toward Richmond in a desperate attempt to regroup. Others were captured amid the chaos. By dawn, the Stars and Stripes flew over Drury's Bluff for the first time, signaling the end of one of the Confederacy's proudest strongholds. The fall of Fort Darling was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbolic collapse, the breaking of a myth that had sustained Southern morale since the early days of the war. The bastion that once blocked the Union's advance was now silent, its guns twisted and its ramparts shattered. The James River lay open, and nothing stood between the Union fleet and the capital. As ironclads steamed past the bluff that had once defied them, the old world of earthen fortifications and muzzle-loading cannons gave way to a new era, defined by industrial firepower and overwhelming force. Drury's Bluff, once a monument to Confederate strength, had become a monument to the inevitability of its defeat. The fall of Fort Darling sent shockwaves far beyond the battered ramparts of Drury's Bluff. For nearly 3 years, its towering guns had shielded Richmond from the threat that now glided steadily closer on the James River. Once that line was broken, the psychological barrier that had protected the Confederate capital crumbled with it. The river that had been a lifeline was now an open highway for Union ironclads, their black silhouettes cutting through the water like harbingers of doom. Word spread quickly through the city, first as rumor, then as undeniable fact, that the James was no longer secure. And with that realization came fear, followed swiftly by chaos. By early April 1865, Richmond was a city on edge. The sounds of distant artillery rolled over the rooftops like summer thunder, and every day brought fresh reports of Union advances on the outskirts. Yet it was the presence of iron on the river, those slow, unstoppable machines of war, that struck the deepest chord of dread. Civilians gathered along the shoreline and watched them from a distance, their smokestacks belching dark plumes into the grey sky, their gun turrets turning silently as if surveying the city's defenses. There was no need for words. Their message was clear. The Union's industrial power had broken through every barrier the Confederacy had built, and it was now bearing down on the heart of the rebellion. Panic spread quickly through Richmond's narrow streets. Families who had endured 4 years of shortages, bombardments, and military occupation now packed whatever they could carry and fled southward in horse-drawn wagons, on foot, or clinging to overcrowded trains. The roads were choked with refugees, wounded soldiers limping alongside civilians, government clerks clutching crates of documents, mothers shepherding children through the mud. The once proud capital of the Confederacy was unraveling before its own eyes. Merchants shuttered their shops, banks closed their doors, and warehouses were emptied in frantic attempts to save what little remained before the inevitable arrival of Union troops. Inside the halls of government, the scene was one of desperation. Confederate officials, realizing the city could no longer be held, began destroying records, burning correspondence, and loading archives onto wagons for evacuation. The Treasury Department ordered that gold reserves be moved to Danville. Departments of War and State burned entire rooms of sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into Union hands. The air above the city grew hazy with smoke as cartloads of papers, supply manifests, and military orders were set alight. In some quarters, flames licked skyward from warehouses deliberately torched to keep munitions and cotton from being captured. It was a city consuming itself before its enemies could. For those who remained, the mood shifted from fear to resignation. The once fiery rhetoric of defiance that had filled Richmond's newspapers and public squares was replaced by grim acceptance. People spoke in whispers of what would happen when Union troops entered the city. Would there be retribution? Looting? Arrests? No one knew for certain. All they knew was that the end was coming, and that it was now a matter of days, perhaps hours. In churches across the city, prayers were offered for mercy and protection. Bells tolled without ceremony, their somber echoes blending with the distant rumble of artillery and the rhythmic churn of ironclad paddle wheels on the river. The Confederate military, too, was unraveling under the weight of inevitability. Desertions surged as soldiers slipped away to check on families or escape what they knew would be a futile final defense. Even within the high command, a sense of despair was palpable. General Robert E. Lee, long the cornerstone of Southern confidence, had already warned President Jefferson Davis that Richmond could no longer be held. On April 2nd, Davis and his cabinet abandoned the city, boarding a train bound for Danville in a last-ditch attempt to continue the government elsewhere. Their departure, under cover of darkness and without ceremony, was the final admission that the Confederate experiment was collapsing. Through it all, the Union ironclads continued their slow, deliberate push up the James. They did not rush. They did not need to. Their advance was steady, inexorable, the movement of a force that no longer needed to fight for every mile. To Richmond's exhausted citizens, the sight of those armored vessels was both terrifying and strangely mesmerizing. They were not just ships. They were symbols of inevitability, embodiments of the industrial power and relentless determination that had brought the Union to the gates of the Confederate capital. Against them, the old world, a world of earthworks, wooden fleets, and dreams of independence, had no defense. By the time Union troops prepared to enter Richmond, the city had already surrendered in spirit. Fires burned unchecked. Refugees streamed out in every direction, and the streets echoed with the clatter of wagons and the shouts of hurried evacuation. The ironclads remained on the river, their black hulls glinting in the firelight, silent witnesses to the final unraveling of the Confederate dream. Richmond was not yet captured, but its fate was sealed, and the James, once its protector, had become the instrument of its undoing. The morning of April 3rd, 1865, dawned under a sky choked with smoke. Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, was burning. The decision to evacuate had unleashed a cascade of destruction, deliberate and accidental, that transformed the city into a landscape of fire and ruin. Confederate soldiers retreating under orders torched government warehouses, munitions depots, and supply stores to keep them from falling into Union hands. Flames spread quickly through the wooden buildings that lined the waterfront, leaping from rooftop to rooftop as winds fanned them into a storm. Explosions shook the ground as barrels of gunpowder ignited, and the acrid stench of burning cotton, tar, and tobacco filled the air. The sound of shattering glass and collapsing timbers echoed down empty streets. Richmond, once the beating heart of the rebellion, was dying in a sea of its own flames. Civilians who had not fled now scrambled to save what they could. Families dragged trunks and mattresses into the streets, hoping to outrun the fire that devoured entire neighborhoods. Churches opened their doors to the displaced, their pews crowded with women and children clutching whatever possessions they could carry. The great Tredegar ironworks, the industrial pride of the Confederacy, glowed red as flames licked its outer walls. The Confederate flag that had flown above the Capitol dome for 4 years was lowered for the last time, its fabric singed and blackened by smoke. Somewhere in the distance, the thunder of Union artillery grew fainter. The war that had defined every hour of life in Richmond was ending, not with the triumphant last stand its leaders had promised, but with a slow, smoldering collapse. From the river, the Union ironclads approached in eerie silence. Their black hulls cut through the water with steady, deliberate purpose, their massive guns pointed forward but unfired. These were the same vessels Confederate officers had once derided as northern toys, scoffing at their strange shapes and mechanical bulk. Now they steamed past the city's waterfront like grim monuments to a new era. Smoke swirled around them as they passed the ruins of warehouses and shipyards. Their turrets turned slowly, scanning the banks for threats that no longer existed. The city's once formidable defenses, the batteries, the obstructions, the watchful guns of Drury's Bluff, had fallen silent. There was nothing left to stop the ironclads from gliding directly beneath the lowered banner of the Confederacy. On shore, Union infantry was already marching into the city. Soldiers from Major General Godfrey Weitzel's ex-Fifth Corps, many of them formerly enslaved men who had joined the Union ranks, moved cautiously through streets littered with debris and glowing embers. They passed burning warehouses and looted shops, their boots crunching over shattered glass and charred timbers. The sight that greeted them was both triumphant and sobering. A city that had been the symbol of defiance now lay crippled and hollow, its grand avenues reduced to ashes. The war that had torn the nation apart for 4 years was almost over. But victory carried with it the unmistakable weight of tragedy. For Richmond's remaining residents, the arrival of the Union fleet brought a strange mix of relief and despair. The invaders they had been taught to hate now handed out food and water to the hungry, helped extinguish fires, and tended to the wounded. Some wept openly as Union soldiers passed, overcome by exhaustion, grief, or the simple realization that their world, the world they had known and fought to preserve, no longer existed. Others watched silently from behind shuttered windows as the stars and stripes were raised over the Capitol building. The war's outcome was now undeniable. The rebellion that had begun with fiery speeches and dreams of independence was ending amid ashes and silence. Down on the river, the ironclads remained anchored, their smokestacks rising through the haze as they stood guard over a conquered city. Their presence was more than a display of military power. It was a statement of finality. These ships, once symbols of Yankee arrogance, had become instruments of destiny. Their iron plating bore the scars of countless battles, their guns the weight of industrial might that the Confederacy had never been able to match. They represented not just victory, but the irreversible shift that the war had brought, a transformation of warfare, of society and of the nation itself. As night fell, the glow of burning Richmond lit the horizon, a grim beacon marking the war's final days. The Confederate government had fled, Lee's army was in retreat, and the once impenetrable capital lay in Union hands. The war that had begun with cannon fire at Fort Sumter was drawing to a close under the shadows of iron and smoke. And as the Union fleet floated silently on the James, beneath a flag raised anew over the city, the truth was clear to all who watched. The Confederacy had been consumed by the very fire it had unleashed, and the world it had tried to build had vanished with the lowering of its banner. When the guns finally fell silent on the James River and the smoke cleared from the burning ruins of Richmond, it was obvious to anyone who had witnessed the struggle that something far greater than a single battle or even a single war had changed. The fall of the Confederate capital and the triumph of Union ironclads were not just the closing scenes of a long and brutal conflict. They were the opening chapters of a new age. The clash that had begun years earlier between the Virginia and the Monitor had grown into something far larger than either side had anticipated. What started as an improvised experiment in naval engineering had reshaped the very foundations of warfare. Wood and sail, once the unquestioned masters of the seas, had given way to iron and steam, and the world would never look back. The lesson of the James was brutally simple. All the courage, training and tradition in the world could not save wooden fleets from being rendered obsolete by industrial power. Confederate gunners, who had once watched their shells splinter enemy hulls into driftwood, now saw those same projectiles bounce harmlessly off armored plating. Forts that had stood for decades as unassailable bastions crumbled under the concentrated fire of naval artillery. Even the most carefully constructed river defenses, with their underwater obstructions and torpedo fields, proved powerless before the relentless advance of armored warships. It was a revelation that shocked military strategists not only in Washington and Richmond, but across Europe as well. Observers from Britain, France, and Russia studied the battles of the James with fascination and alarm, recognizing that the age of wooden fleets and broadside tactics was over. In shipyards from New York to Portsmouth, new plans were drawn. Warships were no longer designed as majestic sailing frigates adorned with rows of cannons and tall masts. They became floating fortresses of iron and steel, built for endurance and brute strength rather than elegance. Naval architects experimented with turreted guns, armored belts, and new propulsion systems. The lessons learned on the James River, the vulnerability of wood, the power of concentrated fire, the strategic value of riverine control, informed the next generation of warship design. Within 2 decades, the great naval powers of the world would launch ironclad battleships on a scale unimaginable in 1861, and the principles born on that muddy Virginian waterway would guide them all. But the transformation extended far beyond ship design. The industrial mindset that had produced the ironclad, a fusion of engineering, manufacturing, and logistics, began to shape military thinking in every domain. Armies reorganized their supply systems, expanded their rail networks, and integrated heavy industry into their strategic planning. No longer could a nation rely solely on the bravery of its soldiers or the genius of its generals. Victory required furnaces, machine shops, and assembly lines. It required the ability to produce not just weapons, but entire systems of war. Ironclads supported by supply chains, artillery manufactured in mass quantities, and armies transported by locomotives and fed by factories. The James River Campaign had shown, 2. How control of waterways could dictate the course of a war. Rivers became arteries of movement, carrying troops, supplies, and firepower deep into enemy territory. The days of naval forces operating separately from land campaigns were ending. Joint operations, ironclads bombarding shore batteries while infantry advanced under their protection, became the new standard. The rigid division between naval and land warfare blurred, replaced by a model of combined force that would define future conflicts. For the United States, the legacy of this transformation was profound. The Civil War had begun as a struggle between 2 agrarian societies armed with 18th-century doctrines. It ended as a blueprint for the mechanized wars of the 20th century. The ironclads on the James were the ancestors of the dreadnoughts that would dominate the seas in World War I and the aircraft carriers that would project power in the Pacific during World War. The lessons learned in Virginia echoed across generations of military thought. Technology could overturn centuries of tradition, and those who failed to adapt would be swept aside. Standing on the banks of the James in 1865, watching the ironclads steam slowly past the smoldering ruins of Richmond, one could almost sense the turning of a page in history. The war between North and South had been decided, but something larger had begun, a global race to master the machinery of war. Nations would build bigger ships, more powerful guns, and faster engines, all chasing the advantage that the ironclads had first revealed. And though the Confederacy would fade into memory, the revolution it had unwittingly helped ignite would endure. The age of iron had arrived, and with it came a new reality. No army, no navy, and no nation could afford to fight as they had before.